Thank you, everyone. I'm Justin Bullock. Going to get us started for the Deep Green team. So our plan is to create an organization, an independent nonprofit think tank that focuses on scenarios and scenarios with transformative AI at their heart. We have a couple of things that we think make this covering some gaps in the space. For example, there are some institutions that do some scenario planning, but they often come with their own biases. They're either military organizations or private organizations that, because of their funding structure and their mission, don't allow them to look at the full scope of transformative AI scenarios. So a few things that we intend to do is basically create scenarios that have transformative AI at their heart and make them publicly available in some detail, and also create a variety of types of games that will allow us to interact with the public, from things like role-playing games that someone might have a specific role that they play that then we can capture the data on the decisions people make, kind of like the moral machine experiments, to maybe having a list of different cruxes or different inputs to parameters that people vote on or upvote or bet on that we could then use to create some scenarios as well. So we'll have some detailed analyses with what we think will be general appeal, easy for people to understand. We'll generate some data for researchers to know what types of decisions people make in some of our games. And then our intention is to have our results public. So we think this fills in a nice gap into what's available now within the community. So to tell you a little bit more about the prototype of our organization, I'll pass on to Colleen.
Thank you, Justin. So we basically sketched out what a prototype for this institution would look like given a little bit more than the 6 hours or whatever we have in this hackathon. The idea is that you can start an institution with like a lot of infrastructure and do something very abstract, but you're not actually testing whether the institution does something useful that other people are interested in. So we have a plan for basically testing that while in parallel putting in place all the infrastructure that would allow us to keep going if it seems like there's interest. The organization is pretty simple. We have a board. That's the important piece of infrastructure to make sure we're going in the right direction. We have an executive director, startup generalist, and then we have a small team of modeling and gaming experts who are actually creating the software or the rule-based systems or causal models that we use for the scenario modeling. A lot of the attention we spent was on recruiting. I'm going to skip over that to the milestone plan for the 4-month execution timeline we have. Basically, first step is recruiting. We get board members in place, we get the core staff, and then we also recruit an advisory board of community members who have some interest in the scenario modeling we're doing. So those could be consumers of the models themselves. That's maybe other modeling teams that are doing abstract or more macro level things. It's also people who have an interest in forecasting for other reasons, perhaps expert forecasters. This could also even be just like Twitter anons with particularly interesting takes. Anybody who can give us a scenario that's interesting to model. Then the core team picks 2 top scenarios from that list that they sourced from the community, evaluates the scenarios for impact, for likelihood of being in the public interest, and then takes a month to just execute on modeling those scenarios given whatever the best approach for that scenario is. That could be wargaming, that could be causal modeling, it could be some kind of simulation. And then we present the results in some kind of likely interactive format to help people really understand the system by tracing paths through it. Potentially interactive games that allow us to collect more data. Also, we mentioned narratives yesterday as a way to trace paths through the system. And then if everything works and people seem to like the results, then we just loop those milestones 2 through 4 indefinitely. And we also have a little bit of an earlier prototype of what we might look like to the world.
Yeah, so we actually have a website live, so we're basically ready to launch tomorrow. As you saw, our mission is to better understand and inform the public about possible futures resulting from TAI and societal effects. I won't read everything on the site, but we've got a little bit more information here on the landing page. Very nice AI art generated by Keenan here. And then you can get in touch if you'd like to get involved. But one of the really fun things that we built that we thought would be a nice touch here is what we were codenaming Sim Duel, which, given the popularity of gambling these days with sites like Polymarket and obviously sportsbook betting, which has taken the country by storm, folks will be able to come in here and place wagers on different outcomes of the games that we're running. So there's an entertainment factor here. There's the transparency to the public and how these games are being run and who's interested in them. And it's also a potential funding mechanism for the organization to kind of protect the sources of funding. We can actually crowdsource it through the bets people are making here on the site. So that's the concept. Bryce, do you want to add anything?
No, this is also.
Cool.
Christine, you look ready.
Yeah. Oftentimes, scenarios are kind of bland and sort of group, kind of vanilla. Do you have any thoughts of how this would encourage the surfacing of wild card, really different ones, the kinds of things where, if I had an idea, this room, I might say it, but I wouldn't necessarily say it outside the room?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I was seeing if we had some text on this about how we might try to stratify the type of scenarios. So one idea that we had when we were thinking about having several scenarios is having things that are like baseline scenarios that seem like they're most likely what would happen, having like a best case and worst case scenario, and then having a space specifically for, I think, what we called wacky scenarios to try to surface things that people may think are a bit extreme or unlikely or haven't considered in some of the mainstream models. So it was like one of our ideas as we generate original scenarios to the question of like, how might we protect the space? I mean, the idea is to have several sources of funding, so we're not relying on like one org that might get upset, and to not be relying on customers specifically, so we can maybe delve into scenarios that are a little more different.
Is there any way to reward people who come forward with these really different ideas?
I think that the obvious thing is that we just actually should prioritize them. It should prioritize them. So like this, at least the way that I would see the strategy of running an organization like this, there's always trying to do things that are timely or likely to be applicable. And then there's the utility that you get from running an organization where you do the really weird things, where it might not actually be applicable. It might not actually be something that you actually end up seeing play out in the real world at all, but it is something that's going to teach your people how to think better. And that's going to be very, very useful in the end. So I would actually just say that, if we actually were running this, I would, prioritize some percentage of like the yearly scenario budget to be intentionally weird, unlikely, and probably not even practically valuable things, just to, stretch the model constraints.
The weird stuff does happen, though. Look what happened in COVID-19. That was super weird.
I wouldn't call that one weird. That one I think was not weird.
I think it was weird.
Okay, we should argue about that later.
Anthony, could we give him?
So you've described this very like experimental and iterative approach, and you gave some examples of like all kinds of things that you called scenarios, but are quite diverse in what they actually are. So do you imagine like the corpus that this thing generates is going to be kind of a big hodgepodge, or is there going to be more like a standardized, this is what a scenario is, and if so, what does that look like?
I think that if you standardize it, you're going to probably make yourself stupid. So no, it's going to be a big hodgepodge because you're going to be trying to model a bunch of different things. They're going to have different rules. They're going to be different models of interaction that are worth, exploring. If we're trying to study how a bunch of teenagers playing Minecraft and it being able to deal with a prisoner's dilemma scenario, that's going to be very, very different than trying to, model something where you're trying to get, a different set of people doing a different thing. So I think that the differentiation is actually part of the thing that's actually important. And I think that also that ends up being something that feeds into the overall mission, which is, trying to popularize these kinds of ideas, which, is going to be done better if you have a higher variance of things that you're doing.
I'd add that I imagine a hodgepodge at the level of superficially what parts of the world are we looking at, and the coherence comes in at the approach to doing the modeling that's going to be more generalizable model to model. That we'll have basically a portfolio of different approaches that we can apply based on the scenario we're looking at.
Yeah, but that's got to be scenario dependent.
Yeah.
And I think it should be like everybody participate. I think most important like scenario nowadays, it's somehow it's like for government or big companies. So that's somehow it's not, much to the AI times. AIGC, everybody should have their own ideas, and this can maybe somehow to defense themselves or to make decisions, not just support maybe somebody's or maybe hierarchy system scenarios. That will be a road. A lot of big things like war happen. For example, if some war, two countries have the leaders to make these scenarios, but everybody, can create their own peaceful one. Maybe finally, the war, we can avoid it. Thanks.
I think last comment from Connor.
So, do you see the biggest impact this would have in terms of kind of actual scenario modeling or as a sort of future mapping tool or actually as a kind of provocation? Because when you first described it, I was sort of finding myself doubting a little bit of like, would I really care? I mean, yes, of course I would care, but like, would the world at large really care? But reading through that set of example scenarios, that sort of Minecraft scenario caught my eye. Of like, okay, that would actually be very interesting. It would almost be like a piece of performance art, or something that actually would make you more concretely feel and think what the sort of AI explosion might be like. So that's kind of so I kind of wonder whether that aspect could be amplified even further, of like a provocation rather than a decision tool, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that you can't have one without the other. Like if we're looking at the history of scenario modeling and generally the culture of strategy in the last 100 years or so, almost everything has come with a combination of provocations like this and things that are essentially pieces of conceptual art that manage to popularize ideas. You know, an obvious set of inspirations here would be, you know, pretty much all of nuclear planning throughout the 20th century to me, where like you have, you know, people like Herman Kahn writing a book that's basically a weird conceptual art project describing things that should never happen. And that also ends up being able to get a lot of things into the discourse that weren't there before.
Just to add, I think the being provocative kind of builds on the question earlier, that that's one way this could be particularly useful, is not just having the same, you know, scenarios that the field is aware of or vanilla cases. Like purposefully try to prioritize things that could be provocative.
Great. That's all we have time for right now. Thank you so much.